Stop! Did you think the golden age of Hollywood smelled only of expensive cigars and French perfume? Brace yourself, because today we're tearing off that perfumed shroud. Behind the blinding smiles and immaculate tuxedos hid a truth so foul it would make anyone retch straight onto the red carpet today. While studios airbrushed every blemish from their faces, the screen gods themselves wallowed in filth, ignored soap, and turned their mansions into dumps. We're entering a zone of absolute unsanitariness. Today, we expose the most nauseating secrets of legends. 10 stars with shockingly bad hygiene. But before we get to the first name, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. Marilyn Monroe. When we say Marilyn Monroe, the imagination conjures a flawless vision: glowing porcelain skin, platinum curls arranged hair by hair, and an aura of immaculate femininity. She was the ultimate fantasy of the 20th century, Hollywood's golden dream, seemingly made of pure light and the scent of roses. But if you had stepped unannounced into her bedroom at the Brentwood mansion, your nose would have caught a very different reality. The heavy, sour stench of an unwashed body, stale sheets, and rotting food. Marilyn Monroe created the greatest illusion in cinema history, yet off-camera, she was a prisoner of shocking uncleanliness that turned her private life into a sanitary nightmare. The tragedy of her slovenliness was deeply tied to her mental state. To her, the outer shell was merely a work costume she put on for the studio and the public. The moment the spotlights went dark, she sank into a pit of depression where clean water and soap felt like an impossible task. Her second husband, baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, was obsessed with order and discipline, and Marilyn's messiness became one of the main triggers of their explosive arguments. He couldn't understand how the most desired woman in the world could sleep on sheets that hadn't been changed for weeks and toss dirty laundry straight onto the living room floor. For Monroe, home was the only place she could finally stop pretending to be a spotless picture, and she surrendered to the dirt with a kind of painful relief. One of the most shocking aspects of her daily life was her habit of eating in bed. These were not elegant breakfasts on silver trays. Marilyn ordered fast food, steaks, or Chinese takeout and devoured it under the covers. The remains of these meals, gnawed chicken bones, half-eaten chunks of meat, sticky sauce stains, and mountains of crumbs, stayed in the bed for days. She would simply push the trash aside and fall asleep. Her housekeepers recalled in horror that they sometimes found moldy pieces of bread hidden under her mattress. The smell in her bedroom was so distinctive that even her closest friends tried not to linger there. Hollywood's goddess lived in conditions that resembled a flophouse more than a movie diva's apartment. Her co-stars were not always thrilled by close contact with the icon either. Clark Gable, who was hardly known for pristine habits himself, was stunned by her attitude toward personal hygiene on the set of The Misfits. He complained that Marilyn rarely showered and often ignored deodorant. Struggling with digestive issues and constant stress, she perspired heavily, and instead of washing it away, she simply layered on more powder and doused herself in liters of Chanel No. 5. The combination of luxury fragrance and the stale odor of unwashed skin created a suffocating cloud. Her platinum hair, which looked like a halo on screen, was often greasy and dirty in real life, slicked back only to disguise the lack of washing. Her wardrobe was a story of its own. The legendary dresses collectors now pay millions for were often in pitiful condition. Marilyn would slip a luxurious silk gown onto her bare skin, sweat in it, then toss it into a corner of the room. Stains from sweat, Wine and food seeped into the fabric, but she barely noticed. If the same dress happened to be within reach the next day, she would put it on again. There was something profoundly tragic in this. A woman watched by the entire world who could not bring herself to care for the most basic things. Marilyn Monroe proved that glamour is nothing more than a thin film beneath which chaos can fester. Her uncleanliness was a cry for help, a sign that she was losing her grip on reality. She was a goddess who smelled not of roses, but of dirty laundry and loneliness. And when we look at her radiant face in the 7-year H, we should remember the price of that pristine image, the total collapse of the self behind closed bedroom doors, where Chanel No. 5 fought a losing battle against the stench of life slowly rotting away.
Clark Gable. If Marilyn Monroe drowned in the chaos of filthy sheets, Clark Gable, the official king of Hollywood, carried a threat of a far more intimate and brutal kind. Tall, broad-shouldered, with his signature mustache and a gaze that seemed to pierce the skin, he embodied the ideal of masculine power. Millions of women dreamed of falling into his arms, but the few lucky enough to kiss Gable on set later recalled the experience with a shudder. His greatest secret, guarded by the studio bosses at MGM like a matter of national security, was a monstrous, almost unbearable stench from his mouth. What looked on screen like Rhett Butler's passionate kiss was in reality an act of sheer will and professional endurance on the part of his partners, who literally held their breath to avoid passing out. The roots of this foul tragedy lay in Clark's early adulthood. Due to catastrophic dental decay and an advanced case of pyorrhea, a suppurative gum disease, Clark underwent radical surgery at the age of 32. Nearly all of his natural teeth were removed. In their place, a massive set of dentures was fitted. Dentistry in the 1930s lacked modern materials, and such prosthetics demanded obsessive care the king simply didn't have the patience for. Gable was a heavy smoker, going through several packs a day, and a devoted fan of strong whiskey. Nicotine residue and alcohol reacted with the denture materials, and food particles lodged in the gaps, creating the effect of a biological reactor right inside his mouth. The most famous testimony to this horror came from Vivien Leigh during the filming of Gone with the Wind. A refined British woman with a keen sense of smell, she complained to friends that kissing Gable was the worst ordeal of her life. "His breath smells like an old garbage dump," she whispered in the makeup room. "I can sense it a meter away before he even touches me." To survive the scenes, Vivien tried to subtly turn her face away, but the directors demanded passion. The bitter irony was that Gable, fully aware of his flaw, sometimes teased her deliberately, eating onions or garlic before kissing scenes and turning the actress's life into a waking nightmare. His breath of death became legendary among the studio's technical crew, who tried not to stand too close to him during conversations. But it wasn't only about his teeth. Gable believed in the idea that a real man should smell like a man, that is, of sweat, tobacco, and horses. He considered excessive use of soap and deodorant a sign of softness, unworthy of his macho image. Between shoots, he loved hunting and fishing, returning to the city in clothes soaked with the smells of wilderness and blood, and he could wear those same garments for days. His sweat, mixed with heavy makeup and the heat of blazing studio lights, created a dense aura around him that no cologne could overpower. He was a king, but a king who reeked of stables and decay from a mile away. Most astonishing of all was Gable's aristocratic indifference towards his own hygiene. He allowed himself to be filthy because he knew his power over the public was absolute. It was the ultimate act of arrogance, forcing the world to adore you while being physically repulsive up close. He exploited his appearance, yet despised the need to care for the body that earned him millions. Clark Gable proved that the Hollywood dream had a very specific scent, the stench of rotting gums and stale sweat concealed by black and white film stock and masterful cinematography. He remains an icon of style, but to those who shared his personal space, he was a man whose mouth felt like an open grave.
Marlon Brando. If Clark Gable suffered from medical issues, Marlon Brando turned slovenliness into a political manifesto. He was the greatest actor of his generation, the man who brought the method to cinema, a system of total immersion into character. But along with that system, Brando brought to film sets a stench that made directors recoil. To him, hygiene was part of the very Hollywood falseness he despised with all his soul. Daily showers, deodorant, clean clothes, he saw them as chains imposed by consumer society to turn people into sterile dolls. So he chose the path of naturalness, which in practice became a path of shocking reek. Early in his career, during the era of Streetcar Named Desire, Brando strutted around in tight undershirts that looked as though they had never been washed. And this was not the costume department's doing. Marlon truly could wear the same garment for weeks, insisting that the smell of sweat gave his characters the necessary animal energy. Colleagues in theater and film recalled that sharing a stage with him was physically exhausting. His skin gleamed with grease, his hair looked as if it had been smeared with machine oil, and his body exuded a thick, oppressive scent of an unwashed man who rejected all conventions. Brando relished the discomfort he caused others. To him, it was a test of sincerity. If you couldn't endure my smell, you weren't worthy of my genius. As the years passed, things only grew worse. When Brando became a global star and began gaining weight, his neglect of hygiene took on grotesque proportions. During the filming of Apocalypse Now, in the stifling jungles of the Philippines, he became a kind of biological weapon. By then, he weighed well over 130 kilograms and sweated profusely, yet flatly refused to use soap, convinced that in the jungle one should smell of nature. Director Francis Coppola Coppola was desperate. Brando not only failed to learn his lines, he also spread such a powerful odor that camera operators and makeup artists worked while barely suppressing the urge to gag. He would eat greasy chicken with his hands, wipe his fingers on his black clothes, and continue the scene, leaving oily stains everywhere. Brando's home life was even more disturbing. His mansion on Mulholland Drive eventually turned into a full-scale dump. He could stay in one room for weeks, ordering mountains of food to be delivered. Pizza boxes, empty bottles, and half-eaten burgers piled up directly on the floor, attracting insects. Marlon lived in this chaos without seeing anything shameful in it. He could receive guests wearing a filthy robe stained with food and hold philosophical conversations about the fate of the world while radiating the odor of old sweat and rotting leftovers. To him, this was the ultimate form of freedom, the right to be as dirty as he pleased and to spit on other people's opinions. His numerous lovers suffered most of all. One of them later recalled that sex with Brando was a mix of ecstasy and nausea. He never bothered to clean himself up before meeting them. On the contrary, he might arrive straight from the garden, covered in dirt and sweat, and demand intimacy. There was something sadistic in it. He forced women to accept him in his most repulsive state, proving his power over them. Marlon Brando turned his life into a grand performance against cleanliness, becoming the highest-paid slob in the world. He proved that you could be an icon of style and a genius while smelling like a garbage dump on a hot day, and the world would still lie at your feet.
Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was a god of the stage, the man whose hips made America blush and whose voice made it weep.
His rhinestone-studded jumpsuits dazzled, his carefully sculpted pompadour gleamed under the spotlights. But beneath the glitter and hairspray lay a disturbing truth. By the mid-1970s, the king of rock and roll had become a man whose hygiene was as much a casualty of his lifestyle as his heart. In his final years at Graceland, Elvis sealed himself inside a hermetic world where the rules of cleanliness no longer applied, and the smell of his own body became a grim harbinger of his approaching end. Elvis's tragedy began with his routine. A prisoner of his fame, he turned into a nocturnal creature. He loathed daylight and spent most of his time in his bedroom, the upper sanctum, where only the closest inner circle was allowed. There, in perpetual twilight, he surrendered to his two great addictions, consuming staggering amounts of calorie-dense food and swallowing handfuls of prescription pills. Elvis adored fried chicken, peanut butter, banana, and bacon sandwiches swimming in grease. He ate in bed, and housekeepers later recalled with horror that the king's sheets were always littered with crumbs, soaked in fat, and stained with soda. At times he was so disoriented by drugs that he dropped food onto himself and simply fell asleep amid the leftovers. But the greatest problem was the smell. The enormous cocktail of medications he took, sleeping pills, stimulants, painkillers, altered the chemistry of his sweat. Those who entered his bedroom described a heavy, medicinal, almost cadaverous odor hanging in the air. Elvis sweated profusely, and because chronic constipation and intestinal problems plagued him due to his diet and drug use, his body seemed to expel toxins through the skin. Presley's skin grew pale and slack, covered with painful acne and boils that he tried to conceal beneath thick layers of makeup and talcum powder. Instead of taking a shower, he often poured entire bottles of expensive Brut cologne over himself, creating a nauseating blend of floral notes, stale sweat, and pharmacy fumes. Concerts offered no relief. His famous jumpsuits weighed tens of kilograms from the stones sewn into them. Under the blazing stage lights, Elvis drenched them in sweat within minutes. After shows, the costumes, soaked with perspiration and makeup, smelled so sharp that wardrobe assistants handled them with gloves while trying to clean them. Elvis himself, however, increasingly skipped proper washing after performances, either too exhausted or too drugged. He could sit for hours in a hotel room wearing the same filthy outfit, drifting into a narcotic haze. The decline of his oral hygiene was especially shocking. Though he once had a dazzling smile, by the end of his life, Elvis suffered from serious gum and dental problems. His abuse of sweets and neglect of brushing led to a harsh, unpleasant breath he tried to mask with mint candies without success. His body was literally decaying while he was still alive. When he was found on the bathroom floor on August 16, 1977, it was the final chord in the life of a man crowned by the world but unable to conquer the filth of his own bedroom. Elvis Presley remains a legend, yet the truth is that at the end of the road, behind the golden voice, stood a deeply unhappy man whose world smelled of illness, unwashed satin, and greasy fast food. Charlie Chaplin. If Charlie Chaplin's screen persona, the little tramp, was a romanticized image of a poor man with a heart of gold, then Charlie himself, in real life, embodied the darkest sides of poverty, obsessive miserliness, and a complete disregard for hygiene. Chaplin was one of the wealthiest men of his era, yet inwardly he remained that hungry child from the slums of London, terrified of spending an extra penny even on a bar of soap. His uncleanliness was not merely a habit, but the result of deep psychological trauma. Somewhere in his subconscious, he believed that the moment he began spending money on such luxuries as hot water or a laundry service, he would be dragged straight back into the gutter. Chaplin's wives and numerous lovers later recalled life with the genius as an endless battle against his distinctive smell. Lita Gray, one of his young wives, shuddered as she described how Charlie could wear the same underwear for weeks on end. He believed that if a garment looked clean on the outside, there was no reason to wash it. The famous suits he wore for years became saturated with the stench of stale sweat and street dust. Chaplin genuinely failed to see the point of bathing every day if a man hadn't been digging coal. He often limited himself to a quick splash of water on his face, leaving the rest of his body to the mercy of bacteria. His hair, so perfectly groomed on screen, was frequently greasy in real life, giving off a sharp odor he chose to ignore. Chaplin's stinginess bordered on the absurd. In his luxurious Beverly Hills mansion, he personally scrutinized the water and electricity bills. If he suspected that someone in the household had spent too long in the bath, he would explode into a full-blown scandal. As a result, the house was steeped in a stale, airless atmosphere. Charlie forbade frequent changes of bed linen, dismissing them as pure indulgence. The man who made the entire world laugh, in private, inspired only one desire: to open a window as quickly as possible. He carried the scent of old London with him, a blend of unwashed flesh, cheap tobacco, and dampness that even his millions could not mask. Most shocking of all was his attitude toward oral hygiene. Despite carefully cultivating the image of a gentleman, Chaplin rarely visited dentists and neglected brushing his teeth. Those who spoke with him at close range noted that his breath was, to put it mildly, unpleasant. It was a bitter irony. The greatest comedian of silent cinema, who needed no words to be understood, in real conversation quite literally repelled people with his smell. He was a king on screen, yet in life he remained that same tramp, accustomed to the grime of London back alleys and seeing no reason to wash it away. Chaplin proved that you can take a man out of the slums, but you cannot take the slums out of the man, especially if he elevates them into a personal philosophy of thrift.
Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart was more than an actor. He was a living monument to masculinity. His Rick from Casablanca and Philip Marlowe from The Big Sleep created the image of a man who had nothing to prove. A hat pulled low over his eyes, a perpetual cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and a rumpled trench coat became his uniform. But there was one detail the camera could not capture, and moviegoers could not sense from their seats. Humphrey Bogart was one of the worst-smelling people in Hollywood. His toughness had a very tangible physical form, a biting cocktail of old sweat, cheap bourbon, and decades of ingrained cigarette smoke. The chief offender in Bogart's wardrobe was his legendary trench coat. The actor had a peculiar attachment to his clothes and a pathological hatred of dry cleaning. He believed that new or perfectly clean garments stripped a man of character. As a result, his iconic coat went for years without ever seeing soap. Over time, the fabric absorbed sweat, rainwater, and the grime of film sets so deeply that the collar became greasy and stiff to the touch. Costume designers at Warner Brothers, working behind his back, tried at least to wipe it down with damp cloths, but Bogart immediately noticed the interference and erupted into furious arguments. To him, dirt was part of his on-screen truth. To colleagues who had to stand shoulder to shoulder with him under blazing studio lights, it was a test of endurance. Yet the coat was only the tip of the iceberg. Bogart was a professional smoker. He went through several packs a day almost without interruption. Tobacco tar soaked into his fingers, his teeth, and even the pores of his skin. Because of this, he carried a smell that contemporaries compared to an overflowing ashtray in a cheap bar. Add to that his habit of drinking whiskey from early morning, and you get a man whose exhale alone could make a conversation partner feel slightly dizzy.
His breath was so sharp that his female co-stars often asked makeup artists to give Bogart mint lozenges before kissing scenes. Humphrey would simply wave them off, insisting a real man shouldn't smell like a flower shop. Personal hygiene ranked just as low on Bogart's list of priorities. He adored his yacht, the Santana, and spent all his free time aboard her. The sea, salt, and physical labor were his natural element, but once back on land, he saw no urgency in heading for the shower. He could turn up to a society gala straight from the deck, wearing the same clothes soaked in the smell of fish and seawater, considering it the highest form of honesty. Bogart despised Hollywood's obsession with polishing appearances and often ignored even the most basic rules of clean hands and trimmed nails. In a world where everyone strove to look immaculate, Humphrey Bogart consciously chose the path of a man who smelled of life in all its unattractive, sweaty, smoke-filled reality. He was an icon, but an icon best admired from no closer than arm's length.
Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was the last great goddess of Hollywood. Her beauty was considered the ultimate standard. Her jewelry collection was legendary, and her personal life became the longest-running serial in the history of the press. She lived immersed in luxury, yet, strangely enough, she rarely immersed herself in something as ordinary as water. Behind the dazzling facade of Cleopatra lay a shocking secret. Liz Taylor, a symbol of femininity itself, had habits that would horrify any devotee of cleanliness. She was a queen who could wear a necklace worth the budget of a small country while casually ignoring the most basic rules of personal hygiene. The first warning signs came from her personal assistants and costume staff. Many of them later mentioned in memoirs and private conversations that the violet-eyed diva had a deep aversion to showers. Taylor believed that water dried out her skin and ruined the elaborate hairstyles that took stylists hours to create. As a result, she could go for days without bathing, even after spending long hours under the scorching sun or hot studio lights. Instead of washing away sweat and grime, Elizabeth simply applied another layer of expensive perfume and powder. This produced a peculiar, heavy scent, a mixture of exotic oils, sweat, and stale cosmetics, which costume workers backstage referred to as the Taylor aroma. What was most shocking, however, remained hidden beneath her lavish gowns. Costume assistants who had to help the actress change recalled with discomfort the state of her undergarments. Elizabeth could wear the same silk slips and bloomers for weeks, seeing no need to send them to the laundry. In her mind, if something was expensive and beautiful, it could not become dirty so quickly. Because of her frequent health issues and fluctuations in weight, she perspired heavily, and her clothes absorbed bodily secretions, developing a sharp, unmistakable odor. During historical epics with heavy, multi-layered costumes, the situation became critical. By the end of a shooting day, her dresses were so stiff with grime and salt that they could practically stand on their own. Her attitude toward cleanliness at home was no less eccentric. Elizabeth was a passionate lover of animals, especially small dogs. Her mansions were always filled with dozens of pets who were allowed complete freedom. The dogs relieved themselves directly on Persian carpets and expensive furniture, and Taylor often forbade the staff from cleaning it immediately so as not to traumatize the animals. As a result, her luxurious living rooms smelled like a poorly maintained animal shelter. The actress herself could sit on a sofa covered in fur and urine stains, wearing diamonds worth millions of dollars, and feel no discomfort whatsoever. To Elizabeth Taylor, cleanliness was something plebeian. She lived in a world where only emotions, gemstones, and roles truly mattered. She proved that one could be the most desired woman on the planet while carrying a reputation for slovenliness among those who saw her without makeup and corsets.
She was a goddess who chose to shine on the surface, completely ignoring what lay beneath her skin and in her bed. Liz Taylor remains in memory as an icon of glamour, but for those who fastened the zippers on her dresses, she was forever the woman whose diamond brilliance could not overpower the lingering scent of long-standing neglect of soap.
James Dean. James Dean was the voice of a generation, the eternal teenager, and a symbol of cool who lived fast and died young. His image in jeans and a red jacket became canonical, and his careless hair and perpetually squinting gaze drove millions wild. But that carelessness was not a carefully engineered stylistic choice. It was an unsettling reality. James Dean was perhaps the most sincere slob of his era. He didn't simply forget to wash, he actively despised hygiene, believing that the smell of an unwashed body was the scent of truth, freedom, and raw masculinity. To Dean, the shower was not just a routine, but a symbol of the very conformity he rebelled against. Colleagues on the sets of East of Eden and Giant recalled that working with Jimmy was a true test of endurance for the nose. He could go for weeks without changing his trademark outfit, a t-shirt and jeans. He slept in them, worked in them, and partied in them until the fabric began to shine with grime and sweat. Director Elia Kazan once admitted that he threatened Dean with fines to force him to change clothes because the actor smelled like a stray dog that had spent a week in the rain. His co-stars suffered the most. Rock Hudson, who worked with him on Giant, openly despised Dean for his manners and his complete lack of cleanliness. Jimmy could show up on set wearing clothes smeared with grease from his beloved race cars, his fingernails black with dirt. He often ate with his hands, making no effort to wash them either before or after meals. His hair, which appeared perfectly tousled on screen, was in reality sticky with oil and dust. He rarely used deodorant, preferring to smell like a man who works, even if that work consisted of nothing more than a few takes in front of a camera. James Dean turned his life into one endless garage. His hotel rooms instantly became dumps filled with dirty plates, motorcycle parts, and scattered laundry. He could collapse into bed without even taking off his boots, and saw no point in making it afterward. This wildness attracted fans who mistook it for authenticity, but to Hollywood professionals, Dean was a dirty kid who constantly needed cleaning up after. His tragic death at 24 sealed his status as an icon, but the truth is that this idol of millions was a man who consciously traded comfort and freshness for the smell of gasoline, sweat, and road dust, becoming Hollywood's first true dirty rebel. Joan Crawford. If the other figures on this list inspired disgust through neglect, Joan Crawford was a woman whose hygiene became a lethal weapon. She was MGM's reigning queen, the woman with the mask-like face and sharply arched eyebrows, whose steel-eyed stare could make producers tremble. Yet behind the closed doors of her mansion, Crawford waged an endless, manic war against germs. This was not a simple love of order. It was a severe obsessive-compulsive disorder that turned her home into a sterile chamber of torment. Joan Crawford didn't merely wash herself, she tried to scrub her own skin away along with the imagined filth. The roots of this obsession lay in her brutal childhood. Little Lucille LeSueur, as she was born, grew up in poverty, working in her mother's laundry, surrounded by dirty clothes, steam, and the sour smell of other people's sweat. When she became rich and famous, she swore she would never touch dirt again. Cleanliness became her religion. Joan believed that a single speck of dust was a personal insult to her status. She forced the staff to scrub the floors up to 5 times a day, personally inspecting corners by crawling on her knees in white gloves. If the gloves showed even the faintest gray mark, a monumental scandal followed, complete with screaming and instant dismissals. Joan subjected her own body to genuine torture in the name of hygiene. She washed her hands no fewer than 50 times a day, cracking the skin until it bled. She never touched doorknobs with bare hands, only through a cloth or a tissue.
As a guest, she would theatrically wipe down glasses and cutlery with alcohol before using them, earning a reputation as the most unbearable visitor in Hollywood. Her famous facial routine involved rinsing her face 20 times with ice-cold water and applying stinging antiseptics. Crawford believed a person should smell of nothing at all, or only of harsh soap and chlorine. Any natural human scent made her physically nauseous. Her mania was especially cruel toward children. In the infamous memoir, Mommy Dearest, Christina Crawford described how Joan forced the children to scrub toilets until they shone, and how a single stain on their clothes could trigger a violent rage. She banned dirty objects such as wire hangers, the source of the infamous line, "No wire hangers," convinced they were breeding grounds for rust and infection. Crawford's entire house was wrapped in plastic covers, furniture, carpets, even lampshades. Guests felt less like visitors and more like microbes under laboratory observation. She built a world round herself where life itself was paused in the name of sterility. Joan Crawford was a clean woman, but her cleanliness was lifeless. She purged her world of everything human. In her final years, alone in her New York apartment, she continued battling invisible dirt until her own soul became a wasteland scorched by antiseptic. She proved that fanatical hygiene can be just as destructive as total filth. Crawford didn't merely fear germs, she feared life itself, which is, by its very nature, always a little dirty.
Judy Garland. Judy Garland remains forever etched in the public memory as little Dorothy in a gingham dress singing about wonders somewhere over the rainbow. The world saw her as pure and innocent, but behind the curtain, this national treasure of America lived a life steeped in physical and moral decay. Early in her career, MGM controlled her every breath and practically washed her by force. Later, once she was on her own, Judy became a woman whose hygiene dissolved completely in a haze of pills and alcohol. In her final years, Dorothy no longer smelled of poppies and magic. She smelled of stale booze, sour sweat, and unwashed hair. The reason for her neglect was tragically simple. She was almost never sober or fully conscious. By the age of 40, Judy lived on a non-stop cocktail of stimulants and tranquilizers. During severe depressive episodes, she could remain locked in her bedroom for weeks, turning it into a disaster zone. Maids and assistants later described her daily life with horror. Judy might sleep in the same evening dress she had performed in 3 days earlier. Wine stains, food crumbs, and smeared makeup layered over one another until expensive gowns became filthy rags. Often, she didn't even have the strength to crawl to the bathroom, let alone take a proper shower. Her famous hair, always flawless on screen, became in real life a dull, matted tangle. To hide the greasy sheen and knots, touring hairstylists often simply put wigs on her, not bothering to untangle what lay underneath. One of her makeup artists recalled a sharp smell coming from her scalp, a clear sign that she hadn't used shampoo for months. Added to this was the stench of rotting teeth. Decades of pills and sugar destroyed her enamel, and fear of doctors combined with constant intoxication made her ignore even a toothbrush. Her breath grew so heavy that even devoted fans instinctively stepped back when meeting her in person. Her living conditions were especially heartbreaking. In her later years, as money dwindled, Judy lived in hotels that she quickly turned into dumps. She would order room service and leave the tray on the floor, where it stayed until the leftovers began to mold. The smell in her rooms was described as a mix of pharmacy chemicals, cheap vodka, and unwashed laundry. Judy Garland lost her grip on reality, and with it, her sense of self-respect. She was a queen of the stage who could walk out before an audience in wrinkled stockings and with dirty fingernails, trusting that her voice would outweigh her appearance.
When she was found dead in a London bathroom in 1969, it was a bitter irony. A woman who so rarely used the bath for its intended purpose ended her life there. Judy Garland became a casualty of a system that turned her into a money-making machine and stripped her of her humanity. She was an icon who shattered at the bottom of a bottle, leaving behind only the echo of a great voice and a sad trail of neglect that not even the mythical glow of her rainbow could conceal.
We are closing this fetid archive, yet a heavy, sticky haze still hangs in the air, one no fan or ventilator can disperse. Today we did the impossible. We broke through the cordons of studio publicists, through decades of retouching and tons of perfumed propaganda, to see the gods of Hollywood as they were known only to servants, costume designers, and accidental witnesses to their private decay. What we uncovered behind the blinding glow of the Golden Age was not mere carelessness, but a true abyss of filth. This journey was not for the faint of heart. We watched Marilyn Monroe, the very symbol of purity and tenderness, fall asleep among rotting food scraps in a bed that hadn't been changed for weeks. We felt the breath of the underworld of Clark Gable, strong enough to shatter the magic of his screen kisses. We recoiled from Marlon Brando, who turned his own body into a landfill in the name of a warped philosophy, and mourned Elvis, whose medicinal sweat soaked his golden suits with the stench of an approaching end. We learned that Charlie Chaplin saved on soap as fiercely as he did on tenderness, and that Humphrey Bogart wore dirt like a Medal of Honor. We stripped the diamonds from Elizabeth Taylor only to find unwashed linen beneath, followed James Dean down his dusty road where showers were treated as crimes against freedom, shuddered at the chlorine terror of Joan Crawford, and watched Judy Garland lose her way to the rainbow in a fog of neglect. What does all of this say about that era? Hollywood was the greatest dream factory the world has ever known, but it was also the greatest morgue of human dignity. The system demanded perfection from these people 24 hours a day, and when their minds finally broke, everyday life was the first thing to collapse. Dirt under fingernails, foul breath, unwashed hair became a secret form of rebellion, a way to say, I am still human, I am not your doll. For some it was depression, for others greed, for others a crushing addiction, but the result was the same. Beneath the golden powder there was always ordinary flesh, and sometimes very unpleasant flesh at that. We are used to worshipping these shadows on the wall, believing in their flawlessness, searching in them for ideals of beauty. The truth we uncovered today serves as a stark reminder. Greatness on screen is no guarantee of cleanliness in the soul or in the bathroom. These people were geniuses at what they did, but they were also slaves to their weaknesses, fears, and indolence. The story of their hygiene is not just a collection of gossip, it is a chronicle of human collapse and the desperate attempt to mask rot beneath a layer of Chanel No. 5. Today we washed the gold off 10 great names. We learned that the true price of Hollywood is not only broken hearts, but greasy collars, rotting teeth, and stale bedrooms. These revelations do not make their films worse, but they make the stars themselves more real, more grounded, and frighteningly close to us. They are no longer untouchable gods of Olympus, but people who, like all of us, could be weak, unkempt, and lost. The archive of dirty secrets is officially sealed. Let these stories serve as a lesson. Not everything that glitters is gold, and not everything that smells of perfume is clean within. The next time you turn on a black and white classic and see a flawless diva or a noble hero, remember what it cost the cameraman and the costume department to create that illusion. Remember the price of every pristine frame.
Our descent into filth ends here. Whose story made you look differently at a beloved film? Which star disappointed you most with their neglect of soap?